In the fall of 1971, at a County 90 equipment sale outside of Grover's Bend, Montana, a 38-year-old wheat farmer named Ruthanne Peddicord paid $55 for a 1948 Oliver 88 that had a cracked engine block. Not a bent rod, not a blown head gasket, a crack you could slip a dime into, running 6 inches along the left side of the block from the second cylinder down to the oil pan rail. The kind of crack that made dealers shake their heads and walk away. The kind that made the men at the auction drift toward the coffee urn and talk about something else. The auctioneer listed at last, the way auctioneers always list the things they'd rather not explain. Last lot, gentlemen, 1948, Oliver 88. Runs when it wants to, which is almost never, on account of a cracked block. She's got good rubber and a decent transmission. Who'll give me 30 for the iron? A salvage buyer raised a card. 30. Anyone at 35? Ruthanne said 40. The salvage buyer looked at her. She looked at him. He shrugged and let it go at 45. Ruthanne said 55, and that was the end of it. The auctioneer marked the sale and moved on to closing announcements. The men around Ruthanne didn't say much, but they said enough. $55 for a cracked Oliver. That's $55 she'll never see again. What's she going to do? Weld it. Ruthanne loaded the Oliver onto her flatbed with help from her hired hand, a teenage boy named Cephas, who had learned not to ask questions about things she bought. They drove 14 miles back to the Peddicord place. The Oliver sat in the equipment shed for 2 days, while Ruthanne finished combining the last of her winter wheat. Then she drained what was left in the cooling system, pulled the hood, and got a flashlight. The crack was exactly where the auctioneer said it was. She measured it with a steel rule. 6.5 inches, tight but not splayed, which meant the block hadn't been run hot for long after the crack appeared. Someone had caught it early, declared the tractor dead, and walked away. That was the first thing Ruthanne noticed. The second thing she noticed was that the crack stopped before it reached the water jacket, which meant something a salvage buyer would never bother to look for, something that changed everything about what that cracked block actually was. Let me tell you about Ruthanne Peddicord, because what she did in that equipment shed over the winter of 1971 to 1972 is the kind of thing that doesn't make sense unless you understand how she came to see machines the way she did. Ruthanne was born in 1933 in Chouteau County, the second daughter of a woman named Ruthanne Peddicord, who had inherited 2 sections of dry Montana wheat ground from a husband who died of a burst appendix in 1938. When Ruthanne was 5 years old, Fern did not remarry. She had 2 daughters, 40 acres of summer fallow, a Ford tractor that broke down 3 times a season, and a determination that people in Grover's Bend respected from a distance, the way you respect a fence post set in concrete. You don't test it. You don't move it. You work around it. Fern couldn't afford a mechanic. This was not a complaint she made. It was simply a condition she managed. She bought a used engine manual for the Ford from a man selling books out of his truck at the fairgrounds in 1940, and read it the way other women read the Bible, carefully, repeatedly, with the understanding that the knowledge inside it was not optional. She learned to set valves by feel. She learned to read spark plugs like a doctor reads symptoms. She learned that a tractor will tell you what it needs if you're willing to listen long enough. Ruthanne learned by standing next to her mother, by handing tools, by watching hands, by asking why, and receiving answers that assumed she was capable of understanding them. Fern never simplified things for her daughters, the way some parents simplified things. She explained what she knew, and expected that knowledge to take root. By the time Ruthanne was 14, she could pull ahead, lap valves, and reassemble an engine to specification. By the time she was 18, she understood something more than mechanics. She understood the economics of repair. A new tractor in 1951, the year Ruthanne took over full operations after Fern's arthritis made fieldwork impossible. Cost between $2,000 and $4,000, depending on the brand. A rebuilt engine cost $200. A repaired engine cost less than that if you did the work yourself and sourced the parts carefully, and sourced the part. A cracked block, properly repaired, cost almost nothing. The art was knowing which cracks were death sentences and which ones were just inconvenient. Ruthanne had learned the difference from Fern, who had learned it from the manual, who had learned it from the physics of cast iron, which doesn't change regardless of what year the tractor was made. A crack in a cylinder wall is a death sentence. Water gets into combustion. The engine hydrolocks and bends rods or throws a piston. No coming back from that. A crack in the block exterior, away from the wada jacket and the cylinder walls, is a structural problem, not a combustion problem. It can be repaired. It has been repaired for as long as there have been cast iron engines, which is to say, since before anyone alive was born. The technique is called cold metal stitching, but it was a dry July. It was developed in the 1800s and industrial machinery, used extensively through both world wars. When you couldn't replace an engine block, you could only fix the one you had. The process uses threaded inserts, precision machined studs of the same metal as the parent casting, driven into a series of overlapping holes drilled along and through the crack. The studs lock together like a zipper. When done correctly, the repair is stronger than the original casting. When done incorrectly, the block develops secondary cracks at the stud margins and fails within a season. Ruthanne had stitched 2 cracks before the Oliver, a 1941 Farmall H for a neighbor in 1963, a small crack near the thermostat housing that took her 4 hours and held for 11 years. A 1937 John Deere B for herself. In 1967, a longer crack along the side rail that required 18 studs and a weekend. That one was still running when she bought the Oliver. The Oliver's crack required 31 studs. She drilled and tapped every hole by hand with a drill press she'd bought for $90 at an estate sale in 1964. And a set of taps she kept in a wooden box lined with oilcloth. It took her 3 weekends. The work required more patience than skill, though it required skill too. Every hole had to be drilled at the correct angle, neither too steep nor too shallow, or the stud wouldn't draw the crack edges together. Minye. Every stud had to be tightened to the same torque, which she measured not with a torque wrench, but with the tension in her wrist, the same way Fern had set valve clearances by feel built from years of knowing what right felt like. She finished on a Saturday afternoon in January. The crack was stitched. She cleaned the block, checked the cylinder walls, found them within acceptable wear limits, and began reassembly. New rings, new bearings, new gaskets. The bearings were the most expensive part. She ordered them from a supplier in Billings, $19 for a complete set. The gasket kit was $8. The rings were $12. Total parts cost $39. Combined with the $55 she'd paid at auction, the Oliver had cost her $94 to get running. She started it in the equipment shed on a Wednesday morning in February. It turned over on the 3rd crank and settled into an idle that surprised even Ruthanne, not because it was unusual, but because it was clean, smooth, the kind of idle you get from an engine that has been assembled correctly, where every clearance is what it should be and every seal is where it belongs. She let it warm up for 20 minutes, then backed it out of the shed and drove it down the field road to check for leaks. No leaks. The stitched crack held. The engine produced its rated power, a measured 55 horsepower, at the drawbar, which Ruthanne confirmed by hitching up a full grain drill and working it across a test strip of ground she'd prepared the day before. The Oliver pulled the drill like the crack had never existed. She drove it past the co-op in Grover's Bend on the way back. Not deliberately. She had grain business at the co-op. But she drove the Oliver because it was the closest working tractor. And when she parked it out front and walked in to check her basis price, a man named Gene Fessler, who sold international harvester equipment out of a dealership 2 blocks from the co-op, was standing at the counter, buying coffee supplies for his parts department. Gene saw the Oliver through the window. He walked outside and looked at it the way car dealers look at a trade-in, running his eyes over the tires, the sheet metal, the engine. He couldn't see the stitching from where he stood. He would have had to get under the tractor to see it. "Ruthanne, somebody told me you bought that Oliver at the Chambers sale. The one with the cracked block." "That's right." Gene looked at the tractor again. "That thing is running. That's right." He walked around the front and peered at the engine. "How?" "Block's cracked. I looked at it before the sale and passed. Cold stitching." Gene straightened up. He had sold international harvester equipment for 16 years. He knew what cold stitching was, but he had never seen it done on a block with a crack that long. "That's a 6-inch crack, Ruthanne. 6.5, and you stitched it yourself." "My mother showed me on a Farmall H in 1963. I've done it twice before." Gene walked around the Oliver once more. He looked at the tires. He looked at the drawbar. He looked at the paint, which Ruthanne had touched up with a can of Oliver Green from the implement supply in Havre. The tractor looked, if not new, then solid. Competent, like something a person had taken care of. "What did you pay for it?" Ruthanne told him. Gene Fessler had sold a new Oliver 88 in 1969 for $2,800. He had sold a used one, good condition, in 1970 for $1,200. He was looking at a tractor that would do everything those tractors could do, for $94. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I don't suppose you'd want to sell it." "Not particularly. No, I wouldn't either." Gene put his hands in his coat pockets. "Ruthanne, you know what that repair would cost if a shop did it? Professionally?" She said she had a figure in mind. $600–700, he said, for a block that size. The labor alone. Most shops won't do it because they don't have anyone who knows the technique anymore. He paused. "You do it for other people?" "I've done it twice for neighbors." Gene nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "All right." He went back inside for his coffee supplies. Ruthanne went inside to check her basis price. They didn't discuss it further that day. But Gene Fessler was a practical man, and practical men have a way of returning to useful information. Let me tell you about the next 15 years, because the Oliver was not the end of this story. It was the beginning of a practice. Word travels in small counties. It travels at the co-op, at the grain elevator, at the parts counter, at the cafe on Saturday mornings where farmers sit with coffee and talk about what broke and what it's going to cost. Ruthanne had stitched the Oliver's block for $94 all in. The story got around. By planting season, 3 men had called her about cracked blocks on equipment they'd been told was finished. A 1953 Minneapolis Moline with a crack near the front main bearing. Ruthanne looked at it, measured it, quoted them a price, and stitched it in 2 weekends. She charged $75 for labor and parts. The tractor ran another 8 years before the owner retired and sold the farm. A 1949 Case Vac with a hairline crack that had been misdiagnosed as a head gasket failure. 2 weekends, $60. The owner, a dairyman named Hutchins, who ran 200 cows south of Grover's Bend, kept that case for 12 more years and sent Ruthanne a Christmas card every year until he died. A 1955 Oliver Super 88, with damage from a freeze, 2 separate cracks, one of which Ruthanne had to think hard about before she committed to the repair. She measured both cracks 3 times. She thought about the angles, the proximity to the water jacket, the likely stress distribution when the engine was under load. She told the owner it would hold, but that he should never let the coolant run low again. He agreed. It held. He told everyone he knew. By 1976, Ruthanne was doing 6 to 8 block repairs a year, on top of farming her own ground. She worked evenings and winters when the field work was done. She had bought a better drill press, a torque wrench she calibrated herself against a known reference, and a set of precision gauges that let her measure cylinder wear to 1/1000th of an inch. She charged between $50 and $150 per repair, depending on the complexity. The money was not the point. The money was a consequence. The point was that she could look at something everyone else had condemned and see what it actually was. Ruthanne's own farming operation was built the same way. Her combine was a 1959 machine she'd bought for $400 in 1968 and rebuilt over 2 winters, replacing the threshing cylinder, the concaves, the feeder house bearings, and the sieve assemblies with parts sourced from salvage dealers in 3 states. A comparable machine from a dealer was $9,000 in 1968. Hers cost 418 years of knowledge. Her wheat yields were modest. Grover's Bend country is not yield country. 50-60 bushels to the acre on good years, 35 on dry ones. But Ruthanne's costs were so low that a 35-bushel year still paid. No equipment payments, no interest, no debt of any kind on the farm, which she had paid off in 1965 after 12 years of payments her mother had begun in 1953. When the other farmers in Chouteau County were calculating whether they could cover their notes at 50-cent wheat, Ruthanne was calculating whether she wanted to put the savings into a CD or keep it in the operating account. In the spring of 1978, the Halverson place went up for sale. 320 acres of dry land wheat ground, the southern third of it better soil than Ruthanne's, bordering her east fence for 2 miles. The bank had called the Halverson loan after 2 consecutive short crops. The asking price was $110 an acre. Ruthanne had been watching that land for 4 years. She knew the soil. She knew the water patterns, which fields held moisture and which ones shed it, which draws caught the spring runoff and which ones drained away. She had farmed the county long enough to know that the Halverson ground, whatever its recent history, was good ground in the right hands with the right equipment. She went to the bank on a Tuesday. She talked to the loan officer, a man named Briscoe, who had been handling farm accounts in Grover's Bend for 20 years. She told him what she wanted. He asked about financing. She told him she wasn't planning to finance it. Briscoe looked at his desk for a moment.
The full 320?
The full 320. He pulled out a calculator. At $110 an acre, that's $35,200. Ruthanne said that was her understanding of the arithmetic. She had $38,000 in a savings account at a bank in Havre. She had kept it there, not in Grover's Bend, because she had learned from Fern that it was better to do your saving somewhere nobody was watching. Fern had kept her money in a credit union in Chinook for the same reason. Not secrecy, exactly. Just privacy. There is a difference. Briscoe called the Halverson estate's attorney that afternoon. The sale closed in 31 days. Ruthanne wrote 1 check. No financing, no mortgage, no points, no closing costs beyond the standard transfer fees. No monthly payment, no interest accruing against a good harvest that might not come. She drove home past Gene Fessler's dealership. She didn't stop. Gene was outside talking to a customer about a new tractor. The customer was a young man she didn't know, probably farming on his father's credit. She drove on. The word got around the way it always does. Ruthanne Peddicord bought the Halverson place. 320 acres, cash, closed in a month. Gene Fessler heard it at the elevator on a Friday. He drove out to see her the following Monday. He found her in the equipment shed, checking the Oliver's oil. He stood in the shed door for a moment, looking at the tractor. It had been 7 years since the day outside the co-op. The Oliver was showing its age in paint, but it ran like a new machine, and Gene knew it. He'd watched it in the fields often enough. "You bought the Halverson ground." "I did." Gene leaned against the doorframe. "I had a customer who wanted it. Young fellow, just starting out. He was going to finance it, had a down payment, everything lined up. Bank called him the same week you went in, said the sale was going to go faster than the financing could move." Ruthanne looked up from the dipstick. "That's hard." "It is," Gene said. "It's hard." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been selling equipment in this county for 23 years. I've seen a lot of farms go. I've seen a lot of loans called, a lot of auctions, a lot of good men selling machinery they should have kept." He paused. "I've also sold a lot of machinery to men who shouldn't have bought it. New tractors when a repaired one would have done. New combines when the old one had years left. I put a lot of people in debt for equipment they didn't need." Ruthanne put the dipstick back. She didn't say anything because Gene hadn't asked her a question. "You've never bought anything from me," he said. "Not once in all the years I've been in business here." "No, and you're farming more ground than most of my customers, with equipment that costs 1/10 of what they're paying." Gene shook his head slowly. "I'm not complaining, Ruthanne. I'm not. I'm trying to figure out how I spent 23 years selling the wrong thing. You sold what people wanted to buy. They wanted something newer, because I made them want it." Gene looked at the Oliver again. There's a difference between what a farmer needs and what a salesman can make him feel like he needs. I've been making that pitch for 23 years, and I never once thought about the other side of it. Ruthanne considered that for a moment. "My mother used to say that a machine isn't dead as long as it's just dead, as long as someone knows what's actually wrong with it. Most people give up on things before they understand them." Gene nodded. He turned and walked back to his truck. He sat there for a minute before he started it. Ruthanne went back to her work. She didn't hear until later that Gene had gone home that afternoon and told his wife he was thinking about retiring. He was 58. She told him he should do what felt right. He sold the dealership in 1979 to a man from Great Falls who changed the brand to Case and updated the showroom. Gene bought a small acreage south of town and put up a shop and spent his remaining years doing what Ruthanne had always done. Looking at what other people had condemned and finding the thing in it that was still worth saving. Let me tell you how the rest of it went, because these stories have a way of continuing beyond the moment everyone remembers. Ruthanne farmed her 520 acres until 1991, when she was 58. Her daughter, a quiet woman named Beverly, who had grown up in the same equipment shed, took over the operation. Beverly had learned the block stitching from her mother the way her mother had learned it from Fern. She had also learned the land reading, the yield watching, the careful accounting, and the habit of paying for things before she owned them. Beverly still farms that ground. The Oliver 88 sits in the corner of the shed, retired but not scrapped. Beverly's oldest, a girl of 17 named Ruthanne, after her grandmother, has been asking about it. Beverly told her the history last summer, the whole thing, the auction, the crack, the stitching, the $49 repair that turned a condemned machine into 22 years of service. The girl listened without interrupting, which Beverly took as a good sign. The best students don't interrupt. They listen, and then they go find the manual. In 2003, the Chouteau County Agricultural Extension Office asked Ruthanne to speak at a meeting about farm equipment economics. She drove in from the farm, sat at a folding table in the extension office, and talked for 45 minutes to a room of young farmers about what she called the difference between price and cost. She did not bring notes. She knew the numbers from memory. The Oliver, $55. The repair, $39. Total, $94. Service life, 22 years. Total cost per year, $4.27. The young farmers were quiet when she said that number. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next slide. The actual quiet of people doing arithmetic in their heads and arriving at something that unsettled their assumptions. A man in the third row asked her what the secret was. Ruthanne thought about that for a moment. "There's no secret," she said. "The engine told me what was wrong with it. I listened long enough to understand what I was actually dealing with. Then I fixed what was broken instead of replacing what looked broken. Most machines that get condemned aren't finished. They're just misunderstood." The man in the third row nodded slowly. Someone in the back asked how she'd learned to stitch a block. "My mother showed me," Ruthanne said, "and her manual showed her. She drove home in the early afternoon." Beverly was in the field running the combine. Ruthanne parked by the equipment shed and walked in and looked at the Oliver for a while. The way you look at something that has been part of your working life long enough that you don't really see it anymore until you stop. The stitched crack was invisible now under 30 years of oil and dust. If you didn't know it was there, you would never find it. If you did know, you could run your fingers along the stud line and feel the slight elevation of the repair, the metal zipper holding the old brake together. She ran her fingers along it, held in place the way it had been since that February morning when she'd backed the tractor out of the shed and driven it down the field road to see if the cold had undone her work. It hadn't. It never had. What do you see when you look at something broken? Some people see the end of a thing. They see the cracks and the missing parts and the hours it would take to make it whole again. And they see all of that as evidence that it is finished, that it has passed the point where it is worth the trouble. Ruthanne Peddicord saw something different. She saw a machine that was telling her the truth about itself, not hiding the damage, not pretending. The crack was visible, it was measurable, it was specific. And a specific problem, a problem you can see and measure and understand, is not the worst kind of problem. The worst kind of problem is the one you don't look at long enough to name. She paid $94 for 22 years of work. She stitched enough other men's engines to help them keep farming through years that would have broken them if they'd been making payments on new machines. She bought land when others were selling it because she'd never paid for anything twice. Never carried interest on equipment that depreciated. Never confused the feeling of owning something new with the security of owning something outright. Ruthanne Peddicord read that engine manual in 1940 because she had no money and 2 daughters and a tractor that kept breaking down. She passed what she learned to Ruthanne not as a survival skill, but as a way of seeing. Ruthanne passed it to Beverly. Beverly is passing it to a girl named Ruthanne, who is 17 years old and curious about an Oliver 88, sitting retired in the corner of an equipment shed in Chouteau County, Montana. The crack is still there, held together by 31 steel studs, driven in by hand in the winter of 1971. The knowledge that put them there has not cracked at all.